6,14. Y por último vamos a ir al mercado de bonos, vamos a ver cómo está cotizando la renta fija con un bono americano a 2 años en el 3,64, repuntando, también repunta el Treasury americano, el bono americano a 10 años, con una subida del 1,2, cotiza en el 3,7%. Tenemos al bono alemán, al Bund alemán con una subida del 1,3 y al bono español a 10 años por encima ya del 3%. Y acaba de dar comienzo esa conferencia, esa charla que van a tener la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, Cristalina Lagarde, y la secretaria del Fondo Monetario Internacional, Cristalina Georgieva, para hablar de los tipos de interés como herramientas al servicio de los bancos centrales. Vamos a ver esa señal que nos llega en directo porque está hablando Cristalina Georgieva.
Recognize that this lecture is special. It is our signature lecture. It is series of central bankers usually coming and talking about top of mind for this community. I am very grateful to Christine for agreeing to come. Christine, as the president of the European Central Bank, plays an incredibly important role in these turbulent times. And her wise judgment has been on display over these years. Extraordinary professional standing, personal charisma. Always she stands above us physically, figuratively, and also in terms of her incredible contributions, remarkable prominence, respect and admiration all over the world. She needs no introduction, least in this house, because during the years, Christine has been the managing director of the fund. She has led this institution ably during very difficult times. These were the times after the global financial crisis, the times of the Eurozone debt crisis. It was also time for the fund to implement decisions around quarters of our members, very important for the legitimacy of the fund. Christine broadened our perspective in a rapidly changing world so we can reflect on inequality, governance, gender, and climate appropriately from the mandate of this institution. During COVID, something that Christine led, the adoption of social spending floors, came to be exceptionally important. It made a material difference in the work of the fund. And Christine, I'm immensely grateful for the fortunes I have to come after you in this position and to advance what we inherited. I'm also a direct beneficiary of your relentless pursuit.
Estamos escuchando a Cristalina Georgieva, directora gerente del Fondo Monetario Internacional, que está presentando a la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, Cristalina Lagarde, quien intervendrá después. Dice Cristalina Georgieva que está muy agradecida a Lagarde por haberle invitado a este acto y ha destacado de ella que es una extraordinaria profesional al frente del Banco Central Europeo, que es una mujer carismática, una gran profesional que está llevando a cabo una gran contribución a los mercados. Dice que es respetada en todo el mundo y que no necesita introducción porque su trabajo fue durante años, ya lo saben, la directora gerente del Fondo Monetario Internacional decía en una época muy complicada en la que ella tomó decisiones audaces. Decía también que durante el COVID Lagarde adoptó decisiones con vertiente social y que eso es algo completamente destacable de una líder en materia de política monetaria.
Before I turn to you, Christine, what I want to do is to briefly reflect on developments since last year when we had the Come This You lecture. Some of our guests and many of our staff were here at that time. This has been a year of determined action of central banks, of synchronized tightening of monetary policy to address the surge of global inflation. Not popular, but necessary. Despite of all these actions, we have seen through the year inflation remaining stubbornly high. It generated in some places concerns about the effectiveness of monetary policy. Can monetary policy still do the job? We fast forward to today, and we are clearly in a better place. Inflation has declined significantly to or near target in many economies as a result of the resolute action of central banks, as well as, we have to recognize that, as well as of fading supply shocks. The forces of monetary policy transmission have reasserted themselves in the end. Now we are in a better place, but we cannot be complacent. First, in many countries, services inflation is persistent, and inflation could yet tip upward. Second, in a more shock-prone environment, we simply don't know what surprise may hide around the corner. Since COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it has become clear that central banks.
Está reflexionando Cristalina Georgieva sobre el papel y el desarrollo que han llevado a cabo los bancos centrales en el último año. Dice que ha sido un año determinante para la acción de los bancos centrales, con acción enfocada a conseguir frenar la inflación, con medidas que, dice, reconozcámoslo, no han sido populares, pero considera Georgieva que eran medidas necesarias. Dice que la inflación estaba muy alta, que generaba preocupación el efecto de la política monetaria en el mercado de trabajo y en la economía, pero que ahora nos encontramos, gracias a esas decisiones en materia de política monetaria, en un punto mejor. La inflación, decía Georgieva, ha bajado significativamente como consecuencia de las decisiones de los bancos centrales, aunque reconocía Georgieva que esas subidas de tipos y la situación de la inflación habían provocado shocks en la economía mundial.
We saw Canada a bit earlier, and that marks a very important development. At the fund over the last year, since we met here for the previous Come This You lecture, we have been on the side of the soft landers. Our analysis has demonstrated that it is possible and likely to have a win against inflation without a sharp global downturn. And in fact, while clearly weaker than we would have wanted, economic activity has been remarkably resilient. We are projecting global growth to be more than 3% this year and next year. So what next? The fight against inflation has come against the backdrop of 4.5 years of extraordinary challenges for central banks. And while inflation is retreating, rates are going down, recession appears to be unlikely, challenges are abound. We are living in a more shock-prone world, a world in which geopolitical considerations turn into geoeconomic fragmentation, and a world of tremendous structural shifts due to the green and digital transformation. And in this new world, central banks must be vigilant to the potential for shocks to unleash powerful inflationary forces and create difficult trade-offs. They have to struggle with the challenges presented by the non-banking financial institutions. They have to reflect on the opportunities and risks from artificial intelligence. And as you have done in ECB, Christine, they cannot ignore climate-related financial stability risks, nor the opportunities for growth and jobs from the green transition. I cannot think of a better person to come and talk to us on these issues, on the structural shifts that are underway, and what does it mean for the work of central bankers. I am delighted that you have chosen for your lecture a theme that I believe would resonate with this audience and those who are with us online. Setbacks and strides forward, structural shifts and monetary policy in this decade, in the 20s. Very much look forward to listening to you, Christine, and again, a very warm welcome from all of us.
Hablaba Cristalina Georgieva de los nuevos shocks inflacionarios a los que probablemente se tengan que enfrentar los bancos centrales y las economías mundiales. Y hablaba también de nuevos retos que están muy presentes en el foco de los bancos centrales, como la inteligencia artificial o la transición verde. Ahora empieza el discurso de la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, Christine Lagarde.
Well, good morning to all of you, and thank you ever so much, Cristalina, for the extremely and exceedingly kind words that you have mentioned to me. You know, many of you probably appreciate the level of emotion that I feel at this point in time. So I'm not going to digress too much about the past, but being here in this room with you all under your leadership, Cristalina, seeing so many of the faces, the smiles, the bright eyes, the brain power that I have experienced over so many years here, and seeing colleagues who have been my companions during these years, is very moving to me. So I will spare you the tears, but I'm not very far from that. So
Decía Christine Lagarde, muchos de vosotros probablemente apreciáis el nivel de emoción que siento ahora mismo por estar hablando con vosotros. Estar aquí en este sitio con vosotros y con una líder como Cristalina, ver vuestras sonrisas, vuestra energía, vuestra fuerza, me emociona enormemente en un contexto como el actual. Vamos a ver lo que sigue diciendo Lagarde.
Some of you will remember, was with us. He was here. So I gave him a call before I came over. And he asked me to pass on all his warm regards, the high esteem that he has for everyone, and the fantastic memories that he has himself from his tenure as managing director of the institution. So here I go, I'm just the messenger of Michel, but he wishes all of you the best in the work that you do and in the mission that you serve. Yeah, he was a great guy. Third, I want to thank you for not having invited me in the last 5 years. Because these are the years that I spent away from you, and I would not be able to deliver the kind of speech that I will deliver for you if it hadn't been for those 5 years and the extraordinary learning, analysis, input that I got from the fantastic staff of the ECB. And I'm forever grateful to you all for having trained me into many macroeconomic matters, many surveillance matters, many program matters, and all the rest of it. But I'm very grateful to them for having taught me at least the basics of monetary policy. I don't pretend to be the top-notch modelist that can deal with all non-linearities, but at least I understand the jargon a little better thanks to them. I apologize also for having asked that what I say be removed from the screen, because I'm notorious for moving away from the script that I have. Although as a central bank, not so much. And I've been suffering from that, but I'll try to follow the rules here. So, you are all familiar with what central banks are. But it's only really when you get under the skin of the
Decía Cristalina Georgieva, quiero daros las gracias por no haberme invitado aquí en los últimos 5 años. No estaba capacitada para dar el discurso que voy a dar ahora. Gracias por el extraordinario aprendizaje y los inputs que he recibido en estos años por parte del fantástico staff que forma parte del Banco Central Europeo. Estoy muy agradecida a todos por haberme contado lo básico en torno a la política monetaria. Lo decía entre risas. Dice, ahora entiendo un poco más de cómo funciona la política monetaria gracias a ellos.
Yeah, okay, like I understand, fine. Read a bit about it, but how long? Whoa, that depends. But when push comes to shove, eventually advisors will say, and I'm speaking under their control here, between 18 and 24 months. So think about the dilemma that a central bank president, governor has and his team. You decide things that have an impact that will be measured 18 months, 24 months down the line. And yet the measures that you take are instantly communicated, and there is instant expectation in this world of instant gratification. There are also fundamental issues that affect the transmission of monetary policy. And here I'm going to quote somebody who actually came to speak, not on those issues, but who came to speak, whether at the Come Dessus lecture cycle or somewhere else, and that's Alan Greenspan. So Alan Greenspan famously wrote 20 years ago, and I quote, "The economic world in which we function is best described by a structure whose parameters are continuously changing. The channels of monetary policy consequently are changing in tandem." In other words, the effectiveness of monetary policy is intrinsically tied to the evolving structure of the economy. And guess what? In recent years, we have not been spared those massive changes. And as a result, uncertainty about policy transmission has been particularly acute. And I'm going to talk about that. Close your eyes, remember 4 years ago. We had the worst pandemic since the 20s. We had the worst conflict in Europe since the 40s. And we had the worst energy shock since the 70s. And those 3 shocks alone have changed the structure of the economy and posed a challenge for assessing the impact of monetary policy. And this challenge was exacerbated by what? Well, by where we were coming from. Because we were coming from decades of very low inflation, very low interest rate, extremely cheap energy, and a period of rather anemic growth. That was certainly the case in Europe. So what did we do? To manage that uncertainty, we introduced a 3-pronged policy framework, focusing not only on forecast inflation, but also on underlying inflation dynamics and on the strength of monetary policy. So we have that 3-pillar prism within which we try to define what our stance should be. And it was instrumental in helping us calibrate the rate path over the last phase of the hiking cycle, fastest at any time and point in the history of the ECB, and then during the holding period at the peak, and more recently, as we have begun to reduce the policy restriction that we had in place. And I would contend, and you mentioned that, Cristalina, that our determined policy actions have successfully kept inflation expectations anchored, and inflation is projected to return to 2% in the second half of 25. And if you consider the size of the inflation shock that we suffered, which at its peak was 10.6% in October 22, and which has now returned to latest reading is 2.2%. This unwinding.
Pues ya ha dado Cristalina Georgieva uno de los titulares que esperábamos de su discurso sobre el papel de la política monetaria y de los tipos de interés en el control de la inflación. Dice que teniendo en cuenta que puede haber shock inflacionarios y que la situación puede evolucionar de diferentes maneras, las proyecciones actuales por parte del Banco Central Europeo son conseguir que la inflación llegue a ese objetivo del 2% en el segundo semestre de 2025.
two specific parallels between the two 20s. The 1920s, the 2020s stand out, and then, as now, we are seeing a setback in global trade integration and a stride forward in technological progress. But these similar changes that took place a century apart affect monetary policy in a very different way, because we're positioned differently. In the interwar period, structural shifts affected prevailing monetary policy strategy. The main lesson for central bankers then was that the dominant paradigm was not robust in times of profound structural changes. That realization led a few decades later to the emergence of modern monetary policy strategies with a core focus on price stability and flexible policy strategies to deliver it. And thanks to these developments, we find ourselves better positioned today to address these structural changes than our predecessors were. The challenge that we face today is not about our goals, which have proven successful, not about our tools, which are sufficiently flexible, but it's rather about the monetary transmission that will be affected by structural shifts, and how our analytical frameworks should adjust to those shifts. So what I would like to do, I hope you bear with me for the moment, but what I would like to do is start exploring the parallels that we see between those 20s in the 1920s and the current 20s that we are going through, while highlighting how these changes have different implications for monetary policy in each era. And I will then, by way of conclusion, try to offer some preliminary considerations for the evolution of policy framework. Okay, so I'm going to take you back into the past. But before I do that, I just want to clarify that my main message today is that we must be ready for change and prepared to use the flexibility of our frameworks as necessary. And to ensure future stability, our approach must continue to embody stability without rigidity. Stability without rigidity, allowing us to swiftly adjust as the economy transforms, as suggested 20 years ago by Chair Greenspan. So let's go back into the 20s. The world economy then went through a series of massive transformation. These shifts pulled in different directions, representing both setbacks and strides forward from the previous environment. They changed fundamentally the structure of our economies. And I will mention two of those shifts which had major implications for monetary policy. The first one was global fragmentation. Sounds familiar. That global fragmentation that put an end to the open liberal economic order of the late 19th century and its assumed permanence. The decades prior to the First World War had been ones of rapid global integration. World trade as a share of GDP rose from 10% in the 1870s to 17% in 1900 to 21% in 1913. Creating expectations and lifestyle. And I'm going to quote John Maynard Keynes. He famously wrote, "The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth, in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. He regarded this state of affairs as normal, certain, and permanent." Quite amazing. At the same time, the dominant paradigm among major central banks was the gold standard, which prioritized maintaining external equilibrium and relying on intrinsic mechanisms for domestic credit to adjust to external imbalances. And then the war came. And that war brought to an end what we call then the Pax Britannica, while the US was at the time reluctant to assume the role of global hegemon sustaining open trade. Economic nationalism rose, and a rapid unraveling of globalization followed. World trade as a percentage of GDP fell. Remember, it was 21 in 1913. It fell to 14% in 1929 and 9% in 1938. Tariffs in most European countries.
Está diciendo Christine Lagarde que en cualquier caso la situación económica, la situación en torno a la inflación no va a ser igual que antes de los shocks que han sufrido las economías de los países de la eurozona en los últimos tiempos, shocks provocados por la pandemia, por la guerra en Ucrania, etcétera. Dice que la inflación va a seguir acompañándonos de una forma más persistente en el tiempo, aunque se consiga ese objetivo del 2% en la segunda mitad del año que viene. Ha advertido de los recientes cambios económicos y del impacto que han tenido en la política monetaria del Banco Central Europeo. Lagarde también ha destacado cómo las recientes crisis globales, incluidas la pandemia, la guerra en Ucrania y la crisis energética, han alterado la estructura económica mundial y eso ha impactado, decía Lagarde, de forma directa en las decisiones de política monetaria de los bancos centrales. Reconocía que esos shocks han cambiado la estructura de la economía y plantearon en su momento un importante desafío sobre cómo evaluar el impacto de la política monetaria. Este desafío se vio exacerbado por el hecho de que la pandemia nos sorprendiera después de un largo periodo de crecimiento anémico, inflación por debajo del objetivo y bajas tasas de interés.
Largely fueled by spillovers from wartime advancement. Machinery was introduced. Progress was most visible with the internal combustion engine, the assembly line pioneered by Henry Ford, and the electric network and motor. The technological boom drove rapid productivity gains. In Britain, for instance, in the famous factory of Austin Motor Company, in 1922, to actually produce a car required 55 employees weeks. Fast forward, 5 years later, 1927, it was no longer 55 employees week, 10 employees week, in a matter of 5 years. And for Europe as a whole, the average rate of productivity growth rose to over 2% per year between 1913 and 1929, compared to about 1.5% in the decades before. Irrational exuberance, thank you, Alan, about technology also fueled a significant rise in stock market valuations. Research indicates that 1% increase in a firm's stock of cited patents corresponded to 0.26% increase in market value during the 20s. But central banks did not have the means and the tools to deal with these booms and busts. Several of them tried unsuccessfully to pop stock bubbles, and then they took a series of wrong turns when the crash came. The resulting banking crisis and a return to the deflationary stance are now widely considered to have played a significant role in exacerbating the Great Depression. A key lesson ultimately became clear for governments. Central banks needed a new concept of stability, and this concept had to be reflected in monetary policy strategies. As the historian Michael Bordeaux observed, in the 20s, central banks tried to focus on both external and internal stability, and I quote, "But as long as the gold standard prevailed, external goals dominated." So the main realization of the interwar period was that central banks in advanced economies needed to be assigned domestic stability targets first and foremost. But then it took another 30 to 40 years to realize that they would do better stabilizing inflation rather than fine-tuning output and employment. So, 1 century later, we are now in the 2020s. And we also face some setbacks as the global economy fractures, while seeing strides forwards with transformative.
Está diciendo Christine Lagarde que después de los últimos acontecimientos que han afectado a la estructura económica mundial y después de esos shocks que han impactado sobre la inflación, sobre el crecimiento de la economía y sobre los mercados laborales, ahora los bancos centrales necesitan un nuevo concepto de estabilización monetaria basado en una serie de conceptos externos e internos actuales. Inflación estabilizada y tasas de empleo que ya no tienen que ser los niveles considerados como tales antes de esos shocks que han afectado a la economía y a las decisiones en política monetaria. Así que quién sabe si a futuro ese objetivo del 2% pues tendrá que modificarse. Es lo que viene a decir Christine Lagarde en su discurso.
Inflation is converging towards target almost everywhere. And remarkably, disinflation has come, at least so far, at relatively low cost to employment. I gave a recent speech in which I actually mentioned that it is rare to avoid a major deterioration in employment when central banks raise rates in response to high energy prices. So this might be a case in point where the story is different. Consider for a second that since the end of COVID, or 2022, since the end of 22, Europe has created 2.8 million new jobs, unheard of in that short period of time. I see two reasons for this greater stability. First, decades of inflation targeting have had a deep impact on how people build expectations about future inflation. And indeed, when the inflation goal is stated clearly, and if monetary policy is credible, inflation expectations will tend to remain anchored, which makes the adjustment process to an inflationary shock less painful. Second, over time, central banks have understood that stability does not necessarily mean rigidity. And we are indeed in a better situation to confront structural changes because policy strategies combine three elements: clearly defined inflation targets, flexible policy toolkits to deliver on those targets, and analytical frameworks which can assess and respond to changes in the economy. We have used all these three elements in recent years to ensure that monetary policy maintains price stability without excessive cost to the economy. But for this reason, the current changes that we are seeing, those structural shifts, are not going to revolutionize monetary policy. I stand to be corrected, but future will tell. I bet you that the goals of monetary policy are not going to be changed. But those transformations are going to have a serious impact on monetary policy transmission. Let me briefly mention the setback, and then I'll come to how I see that it could actually affect significantly monetary policy transmission. Just as we did a century ago, we are now witnessing another wave of what I will call globalization plateauing. The hallmark of this era was the geographical unbundling of production through global value chains, which led to a doubling in the value of traded intermediate goods, now accounting for over half the world trade. But that landscape is changing, and you are in the best possible position to witness that and to analyze it. We are not seeing outright deglobalization in the sense of world trade reversing, but we are seeing the structure of global value chains changing in response to a more volatile environment marked by more frequent supply shocks and fragmenting geopolitics. Our analysis finds that both the US and the euro area have recently diversified their supply of imported goods, leading to a larger number of sourcing countries and increasing costs. In the US, firms appear to be exploring the option of both nearshoring production to Canada and Mexico and reshoring at home. In Europe, the focus is on nearshoring production within the region while still exporting globally. I would like to show you how these changes have implications for monetary transmission as they could partially reverse some long-term changes in the economy that may have weakened transmission. First, these changes could strengthen the link between domestic slack and inflation. A key puzzle that central bankers have had in the 2010s was that policy easing was transmitted strongly to activity.
Está hablando Christine Lagarde que estamos en la era del global value, que está cambiando el comercio, el mercado y las relaciones comerciales a nivel mundial. Dice que ahora estamos en una mejor posición para analizar el impacto de estos cambios sobre la economía y sobre las decisiones de los bancos centrales. Dice que, a su juicio, no estamos viendo un proceso de deglobalización, de que la globalización vaya marcha atrás. Dice que el comercio mundial y las relaciones comerciales a nivel internacional no se están revirtiendo, pero sí que se están produciendo cambios comerciales. Aumento de costes en la Unión Europea y en la eurozona. En Estados Unidos dice que también se están viendo pues competencia procedente de Canadá, de México, y que ahora en Europa el foco está en acercar la producción, en el nearshoring, y que estos cambios de producción y estos cambios a nivel industrial tienen una implicación directa en la economía que tiene que ser perfectamente interpretada por los bancos centrales a la hora de tomar sus decisiones.
All over defined, however. Those inducements to set up closer to home may lead to a resurgence of capital-intensive industries within advanced economies. Not the building of the plant in that low-cost economy somewhere else. No. Rebuild at home. In the United States, for instance, manufacturing construction spending has doubled since the end of 21 in response to policies like the IRA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the CHIPS and Science Act. Such a shift could somewhat attenuate the long-term shift of activity towards services and away from manufacturing, as well as the observed slowdown in capital deepening over the recent decades. And in turn, capital deepening could increase the economy's sensitivity to interest rate changes, potentially enhancing the effectiveness of monetary transmission through the interest rate channel. By strengthening the transmission mechanism, these shifts could potentially allow central banks to exercise more control over domestic outcomes. But these benefits could also be offset if the restructuring of the global value chains led to more volatile inflation. In a stable global environment, the expansion of global value chains facilitated a virtuous cycle of trade integration and stable inflation as global value chains buffered the effect of cost-push shocks. Our research shows that a 1% increase in input prices resulted in only 0.44% increase in output prices owing to this buffering effect. But if supply chains were to shorten, it could lead to stronger pass-through of cost shocks. So strengthening of monetary policy on one account, two accounts, potentially reducing the potency of monetary policy on the other account. Let's look now at the technological progress. Just like in the 20s, setbacks in some areas that I've just tried to describe, at least for one of them, are matched by advancement in others. We find ourselves in the midst of a digital revolution that echoes the technological boom of the 20s. Just as that era saw major development in electricity, automobiles, mass production, our era is witnessing an unprecedented growth in digital technologies. In particular, the rapid development of artificial intelligence looks set to transform a swath of industries, including the financial sector. Financial technology is already having a profound impact on finance. In 22, fintech generated 5% of global banking revenue, totaling anywhere between 150 and 200 billion US dollars. This share is expected to exceed $400 billion by 2028, growing at a clip of 15% per annum. What are banks doing? They're not sitting idle. They're buying fintechs and adopting their technology to enhance their lending operations. By changing the nature of financial intermediation and fostering competition, fintech can significantly strengthen the transmission of...
Se está enfocando Christine Lagarde ahora en hablar del impacto que la tecnología, que la revolución tecnológica está provocando actualmente en nuestro mundo, en la economía y sobre el sector financiero. Decía que igual que en los años 90 el impacto transformador vino de la reconversión, de los cambios a nivel industrial, ahora nuestra era está enfocada en el desarrollo de la inteligencia artificial que cambia a las industrias, al sector financiero y que por lo tanto también modifica la forma de actuar de las economías de los países y de los bancos centrales.
Have outperformed traditional credit scoring models in predicting loss rates, particularly for riskier firms. These developments are already expanding access to finance. Fintechs have been found to process mortgage applications around 20% faster than other traditional lenders. And the use of data could also alleviate the need for collateral, thereby extending credit to underserved businesses at a lower cost. So remember the Londoner who was ordering by telephone and expecting delivery at his doorstep? It's no longer the Londoner, it's the modern consumer anywhere, not necessarily from his bed, who can quickly check their creditworthiness and secure the best financial deals through their smartphone. And that is no distant fiction, it's happening. And that mirrors very much what was happening to that London guy sitting in his bed. So as a result, fintech's credit supply tends to be more responsive to changes in borrowers' business conditions or broader economic conditions, contrasting with traditional banks' emphasis on long-term relationship with customers. This responsiveness also means that their lending could be more cyclical in times of stress, amplifying credit cycles and volatility. But the net benefits for transmission hinge crucially on the effect of digitalization on market structure. What do I mean by that? Digital markets, as we have observed, tend to be affected by the winner takes all, or at least takes most, as is visible in the handful of hyperscalers that dominate digital platforms and cloud services. For example, just 3 US hyperscalers account for over 65% of the global cloud market. Google commands an outstanding market share of more than 90% among search engines. And in e-commerce, business is concentrated among a handful of top players. Okay, competition law, fight against concerted practices, all that they should do their work, and they do. But we have to look at it from our monetary policy transmission perspective. And market power has important effect on policy transmission. The IMF research finds that firms with greater market power are less sensitive to changes in interest rates. I refer to that study of yours. In the US, a 100 basis point increase in the policy rate causes a low markup firm to cut sales by about 2% after 4 quarters. In contrast, a high markup firm barely reduces its sales in response to the same policy change. So why is that? Reduced sensitivity. Well, it's likely to be due to larger profits and cash reserves of those superstar firms, which makes them less dependent on the external financing conditions affected by monetary policy. And more generally, research finds that the superior efficiency and size of superstar firms significantly reduces the labor share of income, which may also weaken policy transmission. So in short, digitalization could make the financial sector more able to adjust financing conditions to economic conditions, but it could also make part of the corporate sector more insensitive to monetary policy. See, I've learned quite well how to do on the one hand and on the other hand. So what can we say at this stage? And I've tried to identify from those sort of 1 century apart, 2 very strong characteristics of transformation, how monetary policy transmission can be affected. It's too early in the cycle to draw final conclusions. But we can identify at least some of the key questions that central banks will face in the future. I think it's important to indicate that the core goals of monetary policy has not changed and probably needs to remain unchanged. Rather than forcing us into painful trade-offs, as happened a century ago, our monetary policy strategies have proved effective, mitigating trade-off between inflation and employment. If we enter an era where inflation is more volatile and monetary policy transmission more uncertain, maintaining the deep anchor for price formation will be essential. But as we begin to understand the effect of global fragmentation and digitalization on our monetary transmission, we will have to continuously reassess our analytical frameworks. And just as in previous eras, stability should not mean rigidity. Regular strategy reviews provide an opportunity for self-reflection. We published the result of our last strategy review in 2021, which mainly took stock of the low inflation era, and we expect to conduct and complete our 25 assessment of our strategy review in the second part of 25, which is also when we reach the 2%, by the way. We believe that important elements of the previous review will remain valid, and in particular, we will maintain the symmetric, medium-term oriented 2% inflation target. But there are 2 key areas in which we need to develop our framework to be more robust in times of profound changes. First, we need to reduce as much as possible the uncertainty that structural shifts create. And we can do so by deepening our knowledge and analysis of the ongoing transformations and how they may affect the shocks we face and the transmission of our policy. In that vein, I have strongly encouraged my colleagues and certainly members of staff at the ECB to be determined to enlarge the horizon, to listen to other fields of sciences, to appreciate what transformations are taking place, because you have to understand it before you can actually measure what impact it will have. Second, as uncertainty will nonetheless remain high, we need to manage that uncertainty better.
Dice Cristalina Georgieva que a futuro la política monetaria tiene que releerse, tiene que reconsiderarse y adaptarse a esta nueva era marcada por la digitalización y por el impacto que estos cambios van a tener a nivel mundial sobre las economías. Dice que el efecto de la fragmentación global y la digitalización se va a notar en la política monetaria y dice que estos cambios generan una oportunidad para reflexionar. Dice que en la segunda parte del año 2025, cuando se consiga alcanzar ese objetivo del 2% de inflación que había dicho anteriormente, se va a conseguir, pero que se necesitan cambios importantes en la política monetaria adaptados a ese nuevo contexto y a ese nuevo entorno económico mundial.
Second, we will review the lessons learned from the low and high inflation periods and our experience with the evolving role of instruments in the policy toolkit. So, history shows that structural shifts matter for monetary policy, even if their effects take time to appear. They affect how monetary policy transmits through the economy, and in the past they sometimes affected the fundamental goals that monetary policy pursued. Today, the goals of monetary policy do not change, because a focus on price stability has been crucial in times of profound changes. But that does not imply that we're going to conduct monetary policy exactly in the same fashion. And at this juncture, which is the end of my remarks to you this morning, I'd like to quote somebody who in 1933, it's not Alan Greenspan. Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, told his chief economist, I quote, "You are not here to tell us what to do, but you're here to explain to us why we have done it." I can guarantee you, and I can promise you, that this is not going to be our approach, and that we will use our best analysis. We will be open to criticism. We will self-examine the pertinence and the appropriateness of what we do, so that with that analysis, that experience and that knowledge, when the change comes about, then we stand ready. With that, I thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Christine.
Concluye Christine Lagarde con un titular claro: el foco en la estabilización de precios va a continuar en tiempos de cambios muy profundos para la economía y para el mundo. Ahora nos tenemos que basar en una serie de herramientas como el data análisis que nos ayuden a ser más eficaces a la hora de tomar decisiones de política monetaria. Decía en referencia a una frase del gobernador del Banco de Inglaterra: no estamos aquí para deciros qué vamos a hacer, sino para deciros lo que hemos hecho. Os puedo garantizar y os prometo que vamos a seguir haciendo el mejor análisis. Primero vamos a analizarnos a nosotros mismos para saber qué hacer. Dice que ese análisis nos va a ayudar. Y después de ese discurso de la gerente del Fondo Monetario Internacional, Cristalina Georgieva, y de las palabras pronunciadas por Christine Lagarde, presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, lo que vamos a escuchar ahora es un coloquio entre las dos.
To ask you to start with a what if question.
Okay.
What if there was an European Central Bank in 1920 and Christine Lagarde was there as a president? When you look back, and it's really incredible, the tour of history you gave us, do you see anything that in these days could have been done differently? Only if there was to be institutional setup for monetary policy of the kind we enjoy today?
That's a really tough question. It's a tough question because you cannot rewrite the past, and you cannot sort of reinvent and assume that the gold standard would no longer be around and that we would, at the time, focus on the domestic imperative. But it's true that if price stability had been the real focus of energy and analysis and work, we would probably, you know, the course of history would probably have been different, because the economic facts that led us to, 1936 were extremely relevant.
Right.
It was, as it is today, very largely about politics, but also strongly undermined by economics.
Well, my conclusion from this is, I regret in 1920 there was no Christine Lagarde in Europe, but I'm very happy that there is Christine Lagarde in Europe right now. Let's go into actually in the important observations you have made about now and the future. You talked about...
Decía Cristalina Georgieva en modo chascarrillo que lamenta mucho que en el año 1920, en aquella crisis, Christine Lagarde no estuviera al frente de un organismo monetario, pero que se alegra enormemente de que ahora sí que Christine Lagarde pueda ser la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo. Vamos a seguir escuchándolas.
Did you have any observations about channels of monetary transmission that were more potent, more reliable, others that were less? In other words, in these last years, what did you see as really relevant for policy, monetary policy transmission in a world of uncertainty, that are lessons we can ground into? And secondly, you talked about the importance of our analysis and tools. Here at the fund, one thing we are wrestling with is, at the time of more uncertainty, how do we go about models and scenarios? Can we stay in the comfort of what we have? Do we need to think about more scenarios and ranges rather than a fixed point. How do we deal with that how do you deal with this in ECB? What do you think we should do at the fund?
Well, I think what was totally unexpected is not so much one shock, but it was the compounding effect of one shock after the other, or one shock at the time of another shock. And I don't think that anyone was really prepared for that. Mm-hmm. So what was helpful in that, with that degree of uncertainty that we were facing, in my view, was certainly number one, the mandate. And in case of doubt, I think having a mandate that is very clear, it might be challenged, it might be, other mandates could have been better possibly, but to have number one, the mandate, to have number two, the goal, and the fact that we were in the process of revisiting our strategy at the time, and that we had decided to move away from the close to but below 2%, and to have that medium-term approach. I think, the mandate, the target clearly defined, the fact that we tried to communicate, and I had underestimated the strength and the value of communication by central banks. It's a very special exercise, but it's one that clearly has an impact, not in the general public, not in the day-to-day audience, but with financial observers, market operators, and those that actually transmit monetary policy. Mm-hmm. That I think has been also, it's a difficult learning exercise, granted, but I think, mandate, clear objective, communication. Mm. And I guess being also prepared to, number one, admit when mistakes were made. Mm. And there is no question that all of us in charge of monetary policy at the time assumed that the energy shock in particular would be a transitory moment, and that we could just see through it, and that the shock that had taken us up would take us down. Well, as a result of the compounding impact and the multiplicity of those shocks, that just didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And that shock lasted much longer, left much deeper effects, and sort of trickled down into the economy from direct effect to indirect effect, and from the sort of the food chain entirely was affected by that. But I think to have the ability and the humility to recognize that, okay, we got that wrong, and we need to reassess, and we need to re-examine what analytical tools we have, what models we use, how we are prepared to be receptive to different indicators and instruments. I think that was helpful as well. Mm. We were the first one, actually, the first central banks to say, okay, yes, we got that wrong. We appreciate that, and we need to address it, remedy, and provide alternatives.
Mm-hmm. We, at the fund, we also recognize that at a time of high uncertainty, a bit of humility would not hurt. When you talk about
uncertainty, but at the same uncertainty, humility, yes, but clear determination as to where you're heading. And how unwavering your determination is.
Continúa ese coloquio que están protagonizando Cristalina Georgieva, Fondo Monetario Internacional, Christine Lagarde, presidenta del Banco Central Europeo. Le preguntaba Georgieva a Lagarde sobre cómo se toman las decisiones en materia de política monetaria. Le decía que cómo se llevaban a cabo esos análisis, y ella decía que el Banco Central Europeo tiene claro cuál es su mandato, la estabilización de precios en este caso, en este contexto actual, que es importante tener claro el mandato, el objetivo y comunicarlo de la mejor forma posible. También decía Lagarde que es importante tener la habilidad y la humildad suficientes para reconocer que se pueden cometer errores y que se pueden rehacer decisiones que se han tomado inicialmente. Decía que los diferentes indicadores que maneja el Banco Central Europeo van cambiando. El Banco Central dice tenemos esto, pero ahora necesitamos necesitamos ponerle remedio en un escenario que además es cambiante y que va evolucionando. Pueden ustedes seguir esta charla que están teniendo Cristalina Georgieva y Christine Lagarde a través de Negocios Televisión en paralelo. Nosotros enseguida vamos a contarles la actualidad informativa, la actualidad geopolítica con Sergio Fernández, pero antes les voy a dar un par de claves. La primera, en materia de sostenibilidad.
Nordea